I used to believe that if you respected the land would protect you. I was wrong. The first thing I saw that morning was a white luxury SUV throwing dust across my grandfather's prairie. The second was a woman in designer sunglasses holding a certified letter like she owned the horizon. The smell of dry grass mixed with fresh rain drifted across 7,500 acres of open range. Hundreds of bison moved through the valley with the slow confidence of animals that had ruled this land long before fences and subdivisions existed. Then she smiled and handed me 14 days to erase all of it. My name is Ethan Walker. 3 weeks earlier I inherited the largest private bison ranch in this part of Montana after my grandfather passed away at 91. My family had cared for this land since 1891. Every fence line carried a story. Every creek had a name. Every hill reminded me of summers spent fixing gates with my grandfather while the distant rumble of bison echoed like thunder across the prairie. He always told me one thing. Never confuse quiet with weakness. I remembered those words as I unfolded the letter. The paper still smelled like fresh printer ink. The bold headline read Final Compliance Notice. Remove all bison within 14 days or face immediate legal enforcement. I looked up at the woman standing beside the SUV. Victoria Hawthorne, president of the Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association. She adjusted the collar of her expensive white jacket and glanced toward the herd with visible disgust. According to her, the animals created unpleasant views for luxury homeowners. She claimed prospective buyers expected elegant mountain scenery, not thousands of wild bison crossing the grasslands behind their custom homes. I almost laughed because the subdivision had been built less than 2 years earlier. My family had raised bison here for generations before the first bulldozer ever touched that hillside. But I kept my mouth shut. Sometimes silence tells you far more than an argument ever could. The breeze carried the earthy scent of sagebrush and warm soil. A calf wandered close to an old wooden fence my grandfather had repaired with his own hands nearly 40 years ago. Victoria didn't even notice. She was already pointing toward the distant neighborhood. She spoke about property values. She spoke about community standards. She spoke as if the prairie belonged to her board instead of my family. Then she delivered the sentence that changed everything. If the herd isn't gone in 14 days, we'll make sure this ranch never operates again. I folded the notice carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I nodded politely. I thanked her for making the drive. She smiled like she had already won. What Victoria didn't know was that she had just declared war over land she didn't understand. And she had picked the only ranch in Montana where every acre still carried secrets buried deeper than anyone in her HOA had ever imagined. Early the next morning I walked the eastern fence before sunrise. The cool air carried the scent of damp earth and wild sage. Dew covered the prairie grass until it shimmered like silver beneath the first light. The distant rumble of the herd rolled across the valley with a rhythm I had known since childhood. Some people hear noise. I hear family history. My grandfather used to say every bison on this ranch paid respect to the people who respected the land first. I believed him because I watched him spend more mornings repairing fences than sitting inside the house. His hands were rough from honest work. His boots always carried the smell of leather and fresh soil. He never chased money. He protected something far more valuable. Legacy. After the funeral I found his office exactly as he had left it. A worn oak desk faced the western pasture. Dust floated through the morning sunlight above shelves packed with old ranch journals and weather logs dating back decades. His coffee mug still sat beside a faded photograph of my parents standing in front of the original red barn. Nothing inside that room looked expensive. Everything inside carried purpose. The ranch itself had never made headlines because that was exactly how my grandfather wanted it. He believed quiet ownership lasted longer than public attention. Most people assumed the property was nothing more than open grazing land, surrounded by newer luxury developments. They looked at maps and saw empty space waiting for future construction. They never bothered to ask why no developer had ever managed to buy this valley. Even county officials treated our ranch like an old family business that simply refused to disappear. I let everyone believe that story. It made life easier. My pickup truck had more than 200,000 miles on it. My jacket had faded from years under the Montana sun. My closest neighbors knew me as the man who fixed broken fences himself instead of hiring contractors. Victoria probably looked at me and saw another stubborn rancher struggling to keep old traditions alive. That assumption was worth more than any expensive lawyer. As I continued riding the fence line, I noticed fresh orange survey flags planted just beyond the property boundary. They had not been there the previous week. The plastic markers fluttered in the wind beside polished wooden stakes carrying the logo of Silver Creek Estates. Someone had already started measuring land that did not belong to them. I climbed down from my horse and picked up one of the stakes. The wood was new enough that I could still smell fresh pine beneath the morning air. I smiled without realizing it. People only move that quickly when they believe the outcome is already guaranteed. Around noon, I stopped by the small diner in town for coffee. The waitress filled my mug before I even asked. An older rancher sitting near the window leaned closer and lowered his voice. He said the homeowners association had been holding meetings with developers for months. They wanted hiking trails behind the subdivision. They wanted scenic viewing platforms overlooking the prairie. They wanted guided wildlife tours without paying ranch access fees. They wanted everything except the one thing they actually needed: my permission. I thanked him and finished my coffee in silence. On the drive back, the mountains stood perfectly clear against the blue Montana sky. The windmill beside the north pasture turned slowly with every passing breeze. Hundreds of bison continued grazing exactly where they had always belonged. Watching them settle across the rolling grass reminded me of something my grandfather once whispered while teaching me to read an old property map. Son, some people think owning land means holding a deed. Real ownership begins when everyone else depends on something they forgot you still control. At the time, I thought he was talking about fences. Years later, I finally understood he was talking about something much bigger. The trouble stopped feeling personal the following Monday. It became organized. I woke before sunrise to the familiar sound of meadowlarks drifting across the prairie. The cool wind carried the smell of pine and fresh hay through my open kitchen window. Then another sound cut through the quiet. Diesel engines. I stepped onto the porch with a mug of black coffee still warming my hands. 3 contractor trucks rolled slowly along the county road beside my southern fence. Behind them came 2 luxury sport utility vehicles wearing Silver Creek Estates decals across the doors. Victoria climbed out wearing polished boots that had never touched Rio Ranch mud. She unfolded a large color map across the hood of her vehicle like she was unveiling a masterpiece. Half a dozen homeowners gathered around her with cameras and bottled water. One man pointed toward my grazing fields while another laughed and shook his head. I stayed where I was. There was no reason to interrupt people who were so eager to reveal their own plans. By mid-morning, I rode down to the fence line. Fresh stakes stretched nearly half a mile along the boundary. Bright orange ribbons snapped in the breeze above each marker. One sign caught my attention: Future Scenic Trail. Residents only. Another showed a wooden platform overlooking the valley. Premium Wildlife Experience. I read every word twice. The trail crossed land that had belonged to my family for more than a century. Nobody had asked permission. Nobody had requested an easement. Somebody had simply decided the ranch would become their newest neighborhood attraction. Around noon, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. The paper felt heavy before I even opened it. Inside was a packet from the Homeowners Association. They claimed my herd created excessive odor. They claimed migrating bison reduced neighborhood enjoyment. They claimed luxury home values were already declining because buyers expected mountain views instead of livestock. The last page demanded immediate compliance with their removal order. Attached to it was a proposed invoice for future legal expenses if I refused. I almost admired the confidence. They had invented authority that did not exist and mailed me the bill for questioning it. That afternoon, I drove into town for fencing supplies. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same subject. The local hardware store owner quietly asked whether I was really selling the ranch. Someone had posted online that Silver Creek Estates would soon expand across the valley. Another customer mentioned seeing glossy brochures advertising future walking paths through protected prairie landscapes. The artist's illustrations looked beautiful. There was only one problem. Every trail in those drawings crossed my property. Every scenic overlook stood inside my fence lines. By evening, the story had spread across the county. Victoria appeared on a local television interview standing beside the subdivision entrance with the mountains behind her. She smiled into the camera and described the Homeowners Association as responsible stewards of community growth. She never mentioned my family. She never mentioned private property. She only repeated that modern neighborhoods deserved clean views and safe surroundings. Watching the broadcast from my living room almost made me laugh. The fireplace crackled softly beside me. Rain tapped against the old ranch windows. My grandfather's framed survey map still hung above the mantel exactly where he left it years ago. I looked from the television to that faded map and back again. The difference between them was simple. Her version relied on promises. Ours relied on signatures. I folded the newest legal notice and placed it inside the same drawer as the first one. I did not call Victoria. I did not answer the accusations online. I did not argue with anyone. Sometimes the loudest people are already digging the deepest hole. All you have to do is let them keep talking until they cannot hear the sound of the ground giving way beneath their own feet. Day 6 arrived with low clouds hanging over the valley. The air smelled like wet cedar and fresh earth after a night of steady rain. I saddled my horse before sunrise and rode toward the southern pasture to check the fence line. Halfway there I noticed something different. Brand new chain link panels stretched across one of the natural migration corridors my grandfather had always kept open. Bright warning signs hung from the metal posts. Authorized community boundary. No ranch access. I climbed down slowly and rested one hand against the cold steel. The posts had been driven into the ground overnight. Fresh concrete still surrounded the bases. The sharp scent of curing cement drifted through the morning air. Beyond the fence, several bison stood quietly watching the unexpected barrier. They did not panic. They simply stopped moving because the path their ancestors had followed for generations no longer existed. I took several photographs without saying a word. Less than an hour later, another convoy arrived from Silver Creek Estates. Victoria stepped out with a television reporter and a camera crew following close behind. She smiled toward the lens before she even looked at me. According to her interview, the temporary fence protected neighborhood families from dangerous wildlife. She described the project as a responsible safety improvement funded by concerned homeowners. The camera never turned toward the property markers sitting only a few feet away. It never showed the survey pins proving the fence stood entirely on my land. Facts are rarely as exciting as a confident speech. By lunchtime, the story spread online. Residents praised the Homeowners Association for taking action. Several comments suggested the ranch should become a public nature park. Others insisted the herd belonged somewhere farther away from luxury homes. One person even wrote that old ranches should adapt to modern communities or disappear. I read every comment with complete silence. My phone rang all afternoon. Local reporters wanted interviews. Environmental bloggers wanted statements. A regional newspaper requested photographs of the herd. I declined every invitation. My grandfather had another saying: never interrupt someone who is making a mistake in public. They usually finish the job themselves. Late that afternoon, I found a small group of homeowners standing beside the new fence taking pictures with the mountains behind them. Children pointed toward the bison while parents talked about future walking trails and picnic areas. One man asked if the viewing deck would be finished before autumn. Another joked that property values would finally rise without ranch operations dominating the scenery. They all spoke as though ownership had already changed hands. None of them noticed the faded stone monument sitting 30 yards away, marking the original boundary established more than 100 years earlier. That marker had survived blizzards, droughts, and generations of Montana winters. It had also survived every legal challenge ever brought against my family. As evening settled across the prairie, the sky turned deep orange behind the distant ridgeline. The herd slowly gathered near the blocked corridor. Their low calls echoed across the valley with a calm that somehow felt heavier than anger. I walked the fence one final time before heading home. The rough metal vibrated softly beneath the evening wind. Fresh tire tracks covered the damp soil beside the posts. Every footprint, every concrete base, every unauthorized sign, every television interview, every online statement. Each one quietly became another piece of evidence. Victoria believed she was building a stronger case every single day. She never realized she was actually building mine. Somewhere inside the old ranch house, my grandfather's survey maps waited exactly where he had left them. And hidden among those maps rested documents that would soon make a simple chain link fence the most expensive mistake anyone in Silver Creek Estates had ever made. By the 8th day, the entire county believed I was losing. That was exactly what I wanted. The morning air smelled like fresh coffee and damp cedar as I sat on the old porch watching mist drift across the pasture. The herd grazed peacefully despite the new fence cutting. Across one of their oldest routes, birds landed on the weathered fence posts as if nothing had changed. Nature has a strange way of ignoring human arrogance. Around 9 o'clock my phone rang. It was a local attorney whose office sat above the hardware store in town. I had hired him 2 days earlier. He was honest. He was experienced. Most importantly, he looked exactly like the kind of small-town lawyer people expected a rancher to hire. We filed a polite response asking the Homeowners Association to reconsider its removal order. We requested additional time for discussions. We asked reasonable questions. Victoria rejected every one of them before the ink was probably dry. That afternoon another certified letter arrived. The language had become even more aggressive. Daily financial penalties would begin immediately after the 14-day deadline. Additional legal action would follow. They also demanded reimbursement for the cost of the unauthorized fence they had built on my property because they described it as a necessary public safety improvement. I read that sentence twice. Then I laughed out loud for the first time in days. The sound echoed through the empty barn, while the smell of old timber and clean hay filled the air around me. They had actually sent me an invoice for trespassing on my own ranch. By evening, several luxury homeowners drove slowly past the entrance taking photographs. Some waved politely. Others looked at me with the quiet confidence people have when they believe powerful neighbors have already settled the matter. One couple even stopped to ask whether I planned to sell the ranch after the lawsuit. I smiled and said I was still considering my options. They thanked me as though I had already surrendered. Every rumor worked in my favor. Every false assumption became another layer of camouflage. 2 days later I attended a public county meeting wearing faded jeans and my oldest work jacket. Victoria arrived wearing an expensive tailored suit with 3 attorneys sitting beside her. She spoke first. She described me as an uncooperative landowner refusing to adapt to responsible community standards. She claimed the Homeowners Association had exhausted every reasonable solution. Several people nodded in agreement. Then the chairman asked whether I wished to respond. I stood slowly and adjusted my hat. I thanked everyone for their time. I said I respected the legal process. I explained that I hoped the matter could be resolved peacefully. Then I sat back down. No dramatic speech. No angry accusations. No surprise evidence. Victoria looked almost disappointed. She wanted a fight. Instead, she received silence. After the meeting, one of her attorneys smiled as he packed his briefcase. He quietly told another lawyer that I clearly could not afford a serious legal battle. I happened to hear every word. I simply wished them all a pleasant evening before walking back to my old pickup truck. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, my phone vibrated with a single secure message. It came from a Manhattan law office whose name almost never appeared in local newspapers. The subject line contained only 3 words. Title review completed. I unlocked the screen and read the first sentence while the last rays of sunlight reflected across the windshield. My grandfather had not left me a struggling ranch. He had left me something the Homeowners Association had never imagined. The game they believed they were winning had not even reached the first real move. The next morning I unlocked the old steel filing cabinet that had stood in my grandfather's office longer than I had been alive. The hinges groaned softly as sunlight slipped through the dusty window. The room smelled of aged paper, leather, cedar, and decades of quiet decisions nobody outside this ranch had ever noticed. I opened the secure message again while a fresh pot of coffee filled the room with its familiar aroma. The Manhattan law firm had completed a full title review covering every acre my family had owned since the 19th century. The report was thicker than most telephone books. Every page carried another surprise. My grandfather had never transferred the ranch into his personal name after my grandmother passed away. Instead, he had quietly placed everything inside Walker Land Holdings almost 20 years earlier. The company did not simply own pasture. It owned every recorded grazing easement connected to the valley. It controlled the wildlife migration corridor recognized by state conservation agreements. It held the underground water distribution rights that supplied emergency reserve wells across the surrounding developments. It also owned the only permanent access easements connecting several luxury neighborhoods to county maintenance roads. I leaned back in the old wooden chair and listened to the wind tapping softly against the windows. Suddenly, every conversation from the past 2 weeks made perfect sense. Victoria had never investigated who actually controlled the land beneath her future expansion plans. She had only checked the surface deeds. She saw fences. She saw grass. She saw bison. She never looked beneath the paperwork. Around noon, I joined a secure video meeting with the legal team in New York. Their conference room overlooked a skyline that could not have felt farther from the Montana prairie outside my window. One attorney smiled politely before placing a digital map onto the screen. Bright colored lines spread across the valley like threads in an old quilt. The subdivision sat almost entirely inside a network of recorded agreements dating back generations. None of those agreements belonged to the homeowners association. Every critical corridor remained under Walker Land Holdings. The attorney calmly explained that if those recorded rights were challenged through improper interference, the company could immediately suspend multiple access permissions while litigation proceeded. Another attorney added something even more interesting. The unauthorized fence installed by Silver Creek Estates blocked a protected migration route specifically identified in a long-standing conservation covenant. Their own construction had created documented evidence supporting regulatory review. Nobody in the meeting sounded excited. They sounded prepared. Professional confidence is usually very quiet. I closed the meeting feeling exactly the way my grandfather always looked after repairing a broken fence. Calm. Focused. Certain. That evening I drove toward the southern pasture just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Golden light rolled across the prairie while the herd moved slowly through the tall grass. They stopped again at the temporary barrier before turning back toward open ground. I watched in silence. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh soil across the valley. My phone buzzed once more. Another message arrived from New York. Every supporting document had now been certified. Historical surveys, recorded easements, water rights, conservation agreements, corporate ownership records. Everything had been verified. I slipped the phone into my pocket and looked toward the distant rooftops of Silver Creek Estates glowing beneath the evening sky. Victoria believed she had cornered one stubborn rancher with 14 days and a stack of threatening letters. She never realized she had challenged a company that quietly controlled the legal foundation beneath the future she was trying so hard to sell. For the first time since this whole situation began, I finally understood why my grandfather never wasted energy arguing with arrogant people. He knew something they never did. Real power does not arrive with loud voices or expensive suits. It waits patiently inside old records until someone foolish enough decides to test what they never bothered to understand. The 14th morning arrived without drama. The skies stretched clear above the valley. The smell of dry sage drifted across the pasture while sunlight slowly reached the old barn roof. Every member of the herd moved calmly through the grass as though the deadline printed on Victoria's letter meant absolutely nothing. In many ways it did not. Deadlines only matter when the person writing them actually has authority. At exactly 8 o'clock, another convoy entered the ranch entrance. Luxury sport utility vehicles. A contractor truck. 2 attorneys. Victoria stepped out carrying a leather folder with the confidence of someone expecting a public surrender. I greeted everyone with a handshake and invited them onto the porch. Fresh coffee filled the cool morning air. Nobody accepted a cup. Victoria placed another packet of papers on the wooden table. She announced that my compliance period had officially expired. She explained that her legal team would begin enforcement immediately. She spoke about court orders, financial penalties, property restrictions, future development. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I quietly slid my own folder across the table. It contained only one cover letter. The first attorney opened it while everyone watched. His expression changed before he reached the second page. Silence settled across the porch. Even the wind seemed to disappear for a moment. The cover letter informed Silver Creek Estates that Walker Land Holdings had formally revoked permission for every non-exclusive access easement being used outside their recorded scope. The company had also filed notices regarding unauthorized construction inside protected migration corridors. Copies had already been delivered to the county planning office, state conservation officials, environmental regulators, and every financial institution listed on the subdivision development filings. Nobody said a word. I continued speaking as calmly as I had started. I explained that no roads were being closed that morning. No utilities were being disconnected. No dramatic action was taking place. The legal review process would simply begin according to the recorded agreements everyone had overlooked. Victoria finally found her voice. She insisted the homeowners association would challenge everything. I nodded politely. Then I handed her another document. This one contained historical survey maps signed decades before Silver Creek Estates existed. Colored lines traced every migration corridor crossing the valley. Each unauthorized fence section appeared directly on top of protected routes. Attached photographs showed fresh concrete, survey stakes, construction vehicles, television interviews, and public statements celebrating the project. Everything had been documented by their own actions. One attorney quietly stepped away to answer his ringing telephone. Another opened a laptop with noticeably less confidence than before. The atmosphere changed without anyone raising a single voice. Around noon, I drove into town for feed supplies. People who had ignored me all week suddenly wanted conversations. The county clerk smiled in a way she never had before. The owner of the hardware store simply shook his head and laughed. He told me 3 engineering firms had already paused scheduled work inside Silver Creek Estates until the legal questions were resolved. A regional lender was reportedly requesting updated title opinions before releasing additional construction funding. Nobody knew the full story yet. Rumors were spreading faster than facts. By late afternoon, my phone filled with messages from reporters asking for interviews. I declined every request. There was nothing to celebrate. Nothing had been destroyed. Nothing had been won. The process had merely started. As the sun settled behind the mountains, I stood beside the old stone boundary marker my grandfather had once pointed out to a curious little boy. The breeze carried the familiar scent of prairie grass across the valley. Behind me, the herd continued grazing exactly where it belonged. Ahead of me, the rooftops of Silver Creek Estates reflected the fading light. Victoria believed she had given me 14 days to surrender. She never realized those same 14 days had given my legal team enough time to quietly place every piece exactly where it belonged before the first real move was ever made. Everything changed within 5 business days. The first sign arrived before sunrise when my phone buzzed with a news alert from the Regional Business Journal. The air outside carried the crisp smell of pine after a cool night. Steam rose from my coffee while the eastern sky slowly turned gold above the prairie. The headline reported that financing for the next construction phase at Silver Creek Estates had been temporarily suspended pending a comprehensive legal review of recorded property rights. I quietly set the phone down and watched the herd move across the valley. They had no idea the biggest shift was happening inside conference rooms hundreds of miles away. By the end of that afternoon, the dominoes kept falling. The engineering company responsible for the planned scenic overlook announced it was postponing all field work until ownership questions were resolved. A title insurance firm requested additional documentation before issuing new policies. 2 custom home buyers canceled contracts after learning the access agreements mentioned in promotional materials were under review. Nobody accused me of doing anything dramatic. I had not blocked roads. I had not touched utilities. I had not interfered with anyone's property. I had simply exercised rights that had existed for decades before the subdivision was ever imagined. The following morning, county inspectors arrived at the unauthorized fence. The smell of fresh cut grass mixed with wet concrete as they walked slowly along every section carrying clipboards and cameras. They measured distances, compared survey coordinates, reviewed historical maps. The temporary barrier that had once appeared so confident suddenly looked strangely out of place against the open prairie. By noon, an official notice requiring further review had been attached near the entrance. It fluttered quietly in the breeze while curious homeowners stopped to read it. Victoria tried to reassure everyone through another community meeting. She described the situation as a temporary misunderstanding. She promised construction would resume shortly. She insisted the Homeowners Association remained fully in control. But confidence becomes difficult to sell once financial institutions begin asking different questions. Contractors started requesting revised schedules. Insurance representatives requested additional documentation. Investors wanted explanations. Every conversation now centered on uncertainty instead of expansion. The same online community that had praised the new trail only days earlier suddenly filled with worried homeowners asking whether their property values might be affected. Some questioned why proper research had not been completed before construction began. Others wondered why protected migration corridors had never been mentioned during neighborhood presentations. The questions multiplied much faster than the answers. Late that week, I drove past the subdivision entrance on my way into town. Heavy equipment sat completely silent behind temporary fencing. Fresh stacks of lumber remained untouched beneath protective covers. Bright survey ribbons still fluttered across empty lots with no workers in sight. The only sound came from the steady wind crossing the valley. It almost reminded me of the quiet mornings before this entire dispute began. As I reached the grocery store, an elderly rancher smiled when he saw me. He folded his newspaper under one arm and simply said that old records have longer memories than proud people. I smiled because my grandfather had once told me nearly the same thing. That evening, another secure message arrived from New York. Several additional parties had formally requested negotiations with Walker Land Holdings regarding long-term access agreements. Nobody was demanding anything anymore. They were asking, respectfully. I stood outside as the last light faded across the prairie. The herd crossed the open grass without hesitation because the temporary fence had already been scheduled for removal under official supervision. The cool evening breeze carried the familiar scent of sage and rich soil. I realized Victoria had started this entire conflict because she believed a few grazing bison spoiled the view from expensive homes. Instead, her own decisions had placed a multi-million-dollar development under growing legal uncertainty. The smallest complaint in the valley had quietly grown into the largest financial problem anyone in Silver Creek Estates had ever faced. 3 months later, the valley looked exactly the way my grandfather always hoped it would. The morning sun rolled across the open prairie while hundreds of bison moved through the restored migration corridor without hesitation. The smell of wild sage drifted through the cool air. Meadowlarks sang from the old fence posts. The only tracks crossing the grass belonged to wildlife and the ranch trucks that had traveled those same paths for generations. The temporary fence was gone. Every concrete post had been removed under official supervision. Fresh native grass had already begun covering the disturbed ground. From a distance, nobody would have guessed that one of the largest property disputes in the county had unfolded right there. Silver Creek Estates looked different too. Construction remained unfinished across several sections of the development, while revised agreements worked their way through lawyers and planners. New promotional materials quietly disappeared from real estate websites. The scenic overlook was never built. The unauthorized trail existed only as faded lines on forgotten marketing brochures. Homeowners who had once celebrated the expansion now attended meetings asking for transparency instead of promises. The loud certainty that had started everything had slowly been replaced by careful questions. One afternoon I received a formal request from Victoria asking to meet at the ranch. She arrived alone. No attorneys. No television cameras. No luxury convoy stretching down the driveway. The breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh hay while the porch creaked beneath our boots. She looked across the valley for a long moment before speaking. Her voice was quieter than I remembered. She admitted they had relied on assumptions instead of facts. She acknowledged they had mistaken confidence for authority. She asked whether Walker Land Holdings would consider working with the community moving forward. I listened without interruption. Then I told her something my grandfather had repeated more times than I could count. Land remembers every promise people make to it. If you treat it like an obstacle, it eventually becomes one. If you respect it first, it usually gives something back. We reached an agreement built on recorded rights instead of imagined ones. The protected migration corridor would remain permanently open. Future planning would require proper review before anyone placed another stake into the ground. The Homeowners Association accepted those conditions without argument. There was no dramatic celebration when the paperwork was completed. There were no victory speeches. The most satisfying endings rarely arrive with applause. They arrive with silence because everything that needed to be said has already been written into the record. That evening I climbed the same ridge where my grandfather used to watch the herd during sunset. The sky glowed orange behind the mountains while long shadows stretched across the prairie. I could still picture him standing there with worn gloves tucked into his back pocket, and an old coffee mug warming his hands. He always believed the strongest fences were never made of wood or wire. They were built from patience, preparation, and truth. I finally understood what he meant. Victoria believed this story had started with a few bison standing too close to expensive houses. In reality, it had started decades earlier when one careful rancher quietly protected every document that mattered long after everyone else stopped paying attention. I looked across 7,500 acres of open Montana prairie and listened to the deep rolling calls of the herd echo through the valley once again. Nothing about the land had changed. The only thing that changed was that everyone finally understood who had been protecting it all along. Justice never needed to shout across the prairie. It simply waited until the truth had nowhere left to hide.